On the evening of April 17, 2013, the town of West, Texas was quiet. Fewer than 3,000 people lived there. It was the kind of place where high school football mattered more than politics, where families had lived for generations, and where the skyline was defined by grain silos and church steeples. At the edge of town sat the West Fertilizer Company. It had been there for decades. Locals barely noticed it anymore. It was simply part of the landscape, a low industrial building storing agricultural chemicals for nearby farms. Children played sports less than a mile away. A nursing home sat across the street. An apartment complex stood nearby. No one considered it dangerous. Inside the facility were massive quantities of ammonium nitrate, a chemical widely used as fertilizer, but also known worldwide as an explosive. It was the same compound used in the Oklahoma City bombing. It was the same compound that had destroyed ships, factories, and cities when improperly stored. But in West Texas, it sat in wooden bins, unsprinklered, unprotected, and largely uninspected. Shortly before 8 p.m., a fire broke out at the facility. At first, it seemed routine, a glow in the distance, smoke rising. Local volunteer firefighters responded, just as they always did. They had no specialized training in chemical fires. They were not warned about the scale of the danger. No emergency alerts were issued to evacuate nearby residents. The nursing home across the street continued its evening routine. Within minutes, the fire intensified. Then, without warning, the facility detonated. The explosion was so powerful it registered as a 2.1 magnitude earthquake. Windows shattered miles away. A massive fireball erupted into the sky, followed by a shockwave that flattened entire blocks. Homes disintegrated. Vehicles were hurled through the air. The nursing home collapsed. The apartment complex across the street was obliterated. 15 people were killed instantly. 12 of them were first responders. More than 260 were injured. Entire neighborhoods were erased. For those who survived, the aftermath looked like a war zone: twisted metal, smoldering debris, concrete reduced to dust. Fires burned uncontrolled through the night. Families searched through rubble where their homes had stood hours earlier. The town's emergency services were crippled. Hospitals were overwhelmed. And almost immediately, questions began to surface. Why was such a volatile chemical stored so close to homes, schools, and medical facilities? Why were firefighters sent in without proper warnings? Why had the facility never been required to install basic fire suppression systems? Why had federal regulators visited the site so rarely? And why had violations gone largely unaddressed? As investigators began piecing together what had happened, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. West Fertilizer had a long history of safety issues. The company stored hundreds of tons of ammonium nitrate without modern safeguards. It had failed to properly disclose its chemical inventory to emergency planners. It had not been meaningfully inspected by federal agencies in years. Despite handling materials capable of mass destruction, it operated under regulatory loopholes designed for small agricultural businesses. In the years before the explosion, the facility had reported to one federal agency that it posed no serious fire risk. To another, it admitted storing large quantities of explosive material. These contradictions went unnoticed. No one connected the dots. The Environmental Protection Agency had not inspected the plant since 2006. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration had not conducted a comprehensive safety inspection in nearly 3 decades. State regulators relied largely on self-reported data. Local officials trusted federal oversight that barely existed. In effect, the system assumed the company was safe, without verifying it. After the explosion, federal authorities promised answers. Investigations were announced. Press conferences were held. Officials spoke of tragedy, lessons learned, and the need for reform. But as weeks passed, the narrative began to shift. Responsibility became harder to assign. The Chemical Safety Board concluded that the disaster was preventable. It cited inadequate regulations, poor safety practices, and a lack of oversight, but it had no power to enforce changes. Its recommendations were advisory only. Criminal charges were quietly considered and then abandoned. The company itself faced no federal criminal prosecution. No executives went to prison. No major fines were imposed. Insurance covered much of the damage. Lawsuits dragged on for years, many settling quietly, others dismissed. Meanwhile, federal agencies resisted calls for stronger ammonium nitrate regulations. Industry lobbyists argued that tighter rules would harm farmers and small businesses. Proposed reforms stalled. Some were withdrawn entirely. Across the country, similar facilities continued operating under the same lax standards. For the people of West, the explosion was not just an accident. It was the result of a system that valued convenience over safety, cost savings over human life, and regulatory compliance on paper rather than in reality. And as attention faded, the deeper truth became harder to ignore. The disaster was not caused by a single fire. It was caused by decades of neglect, quietly protected by laws written to look the other way. In the months after the explosion, the town of West waited for accountability. Funerals were held, memorials were built, streets were renamed after the dead. But behind the public expressions of sympathy, a quieter process was unfolding, one that would determine whether anyone would actually be held responsible. Almost immediately, the investigation fractured. Multiple agencies claimed jurisdiction. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives examined the blast itself. The Chemical Safety Board analyzed safety failures. The EPA reviewed environmental violations. OSHA looked at workplace safety. Local prosecutors weighed criminal charges. Each agency examined a piece of the disaster, but no single authority took full ownership of the truth. This fragmentation mattered, because every agency involved had known something before the explosion, and none had acted. Records showed that West Fertilizer had repeatedly failed to submit accurate chemical inventories. It had misclassified ammonium nitrate as non-hazardous in filings to local emergency planners. It had stored explosive material in wooden structures without sprinklers, blast walls, or temperature controls. It had no risk management plan, no modern fire suppression system, and no meaningful emergency coordination with local responders. Yet none of this triggered enforcement. OSHA's absence was especially glaring. The agency had not conducted a comprehensive inspection of the facility since 1985. Nearly 3 decades had passed without a full safety review. During that time, federal policy had shifted toward voluntary compliance, relying on companies to self-report hazards rather than actively enforcing standards. West Fertilizer benefited from this approach. It operated under agricultural exemptions that placed it outside many industrial safety rules. Ammonium nitrate, despite its explosive potential, was regulated primarily as a fertilizer, not a bomb precursor. The company fell into a regulatory gray zone, dangerous enough to devastate a town, but categorized as routine enough to avoid scrutiny. When investigators attempted to determine exactly how the fire started, the evidence was largely gone. The blast had destroyed the facility almost entirely. Physical clues were buried beneath rubble. Witnesses were dead. Firefighters who might have provided insight were among the casualties. The lack of evidence shifted focus away from causation and toward compliance. And compliance on paper told a misleading story. Federal filings showed that West Fertilizer had technically met many reporting requirements. Boxes were checked, forms were filed, risk assessments were submitted, even if they were inaccurate or incomplete. Regulators, stretched thin and underfunded, had little capacity to verify claims on the ground. In effect, The system trusted paperwork over reality. As families of the victims pushed for criminal charges, they encountered a wall of legal complexity. Prosecutors struggled to identify a clear statute that had been violated. The company's actions were negligent, even reckless, but not clearly illegal under existing law. The regulatory framework had been designed to prevent accountability, not enforce it. When the ATF concluded its investigation, it quietly announced that it could not determine the cause of the fire. Without a definitive cause, criminal prosecution became even less likely. The case drifted. Civil lawsuits followed, but they were fragmented and slow. Some families settled for undisclosed amounts. Others fought for years. Many claims were limited by liability caps and insurance coverage. The company's financial exposure was contained. Meanwhile, the broader regulatory response stalled. In Washington, lawmakers proposed reforms to strengthen ammonium nitrate storage rules. Industry groups mobilized immediately. Fertilizer associations warned of increased costs. Agricultural lobbies framed regulation as an attack on farmers. Draft rules were softened, delayed, or withdrawn altogether. Years passed. The Chemical Safety Board issued a damning report, concluding that the disaster was foreseeable and preventable. It recommended sweeping changes to chemical safety oversight, but the board had no enforcement authority. Its findings carried moral weight, not legal force. Federal agencies acknowledged failures, but no agency accepted responsibility. The explosion in West became an anomaly rather than a warning, a tragic outlier, not evidence of systemic collapse. Other facilities storing similar quantities of ammonium nitrate continued operating near schools, hospitals, and residential areas across the country. The public moved on. But for those who examined the case closely, the pattern was unmistakable. A company handling explosive material was allowed to self-regulate. Federal oversight was minimal by design. Regulatory agencies operated in silos. Political pressure discouraged enforcement. Legal loopholes shielded executives from prosecution. And when disaster struck, responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. The system worked exactly as it had been built to work. The dead firefighters were honored as heroes, but the conditions that killed them remained unchanged. Their names were etched into memorials, while the policies that failed them stayed intact. In West, the rebuilt town carried scars invisible to outsiders. Empty lots marked where families once lived. Survivors spoke quietly about what they had lost. Many stopped believing that justice would ever come. The explosion had been sudden. The cover-up was slow, methodical, and complete. And across America, thousands of similar facilities continued storing the same chemicals, under the same rules, waiting for the next fire and the next town to disappear. In the years after the explosion, the name West, Texas, slowly faded from national memory. The images that once filled television screens, the fireball, the flattened neighborhoods, the shattered school, were replaced by new disasters, new scandals, new outrages. But inside federal agencies, the case never truly closed. It was filed away, cited in reports, referenced in internal memos, and quietly used as an example of what could happen when everything went wrong, without ever being allowed to change how the system worked. What followed was not reform, but erosion. Budget cuts weakened the very agencies tasked with preventing similar catastrophes. The Chemical Safety Board, whose investigation had exposed deep regulatory failures, found itself increasingly marginalized. Its funding was threatened repeatedly. Board members were removed or resigned under political pressure. Its recommendations were ignored or shelved. The agency that had warned most clearly about systemic danger was slowly dismantled. OSHA remained understaffed and overwhelmed. Inspections became rarer. Enforcement actions declined. The philosophy of compliance assistance replaced punishment. Companies were encouraged to cooperate voluntarily rather than compelled to follow rules. The logic was simple. Regulation was framed as an economic burden, and enforcement as an obstacle to growth. Ammonium nitrate remained trapped in a regulatory blind spot. Despite its role in some of the deadliest explosions in modern history, from Texas City in 1947 to Oklahoma City in 1995 to West in 2013, it continued to be classified primarily as a fertilizer. Storage requirements varied wildly by state. Reporting standards depended on self-disclosure. Emergency planners often had no accurate information about what was stored in their own communities. Fire departments across the country quietly reviewed their protocols and discovered a disturbing truth. Many first responders did not know which facilities in their jurisdictions stored explosive materials. Some had never been informed. Others had outdated records. Training materials often minimized the risks or failed to mention ammonium nitrate at all. The men who died in West were not unique victims. They were representatives of a broader failure, one that placed firefighters in harm's way without warning, preparation, or protection. At the corporate level, nothing fundamentally changed. Facilities similar to West Fertilizer continued operating near residential neighborhoods. Wooden warehouses remained common. Sprinkler systems were optional. Blast walls were rare. Risk assessments were often theoretical exercises, disconnected from physical reality. The cost of compliance was still considered higher than the cost of catastrophe. Insurance models reinforced this calculation. Companies insured against explosions without being required to reduce risk. Payouts were capped. Legal exposure was limited. Financial responsibility was dispersed across insurers, settlements, and government aid. The human cost, meanwhile, was borne entirely by communities. For the families of the dead, closure never arrived. No executive was charged. No regulatory agency admitted fault. No law was passed bearing the names of the fallen firefighters. The disaster became a lesson that everyone acknowledged and no one applied. In legal terms, the explosion was categorized as an accident. In moral terms, it was anything but. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to trust industry, underfund oversight, fragment responsibility, and prioritize economic convenience over human life. The fire in West did not reveal a single failure. It exposed an entire architecture of neglect. Years later, investigative journalists uncovered documents showing that federal officials had internally debated stricter ammonium nitrate rules and abandoned them. Political pressure from agricultural interests had been decisive. The fear of backlash outweighed the memory of the dead. The conclusion was never announced publicly, but it was clear. Nothing would change unless another town was destroyed. And that possibility never went away. Across the United States, thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate continued to be stored in aging facilities. Some sat beside schools. Others bordered nursing homes. Many were in volunteer firefighter jurisdictions with limited equipment and minimal training for chemical fires. The same conditions that existed in West existed elsewhere, unseen, unexamined, uncorrected. The explosion became a warning that was acknowledged but not acted upon. Disasters are often described as sudden, but the truth is slower and more uncomfortable. They are built over time, through decisions not made, inspections not conducted, rules not enforced, and risks deliberately underestimated. West Texas was not destroyed in seconds. It was dismantled over decades. By the time the fire began, the outcome was already set. The fertilizer plant was the spark. The system was the fuel. And when it burned, it revealed something far larger than a single explosion. A quiet agreement that some lives are expendable, some risks acceptable, and some truths too inconvenient to confront. The town rebuilt. The names were remembered, the lessons were written down. But the machinery that allowed it to happen remained intact. Waiting.